Y'all, this is not just messy, this is heartbreaking. Because what Claressa Shields just did on Instagram Live has the entire internet in shock, disbelief, and straight-up rage. The woman known for being unbreakable was crying, voice shaking, eyes swollen. And then she dropped a bomb nobody saw coming. She said she's pregnant. And the reason she hid it? Because the man she trusted, the man who promised her a future, allegedly lied to her face. Claressa Shields didn't just expose a secret pregnancy. She exposed what she calls a calculated betrayal. She told the world that behind closed doors, Papoose allegedly sold her a dream, marriage, commitment, forever. She says he made her believe his marriage was already over, that divorce papers were coming, that she was next. And here's where it gets dark. Claressa claims she gave her body, her trust, and her future to those promises. Promises she now says were never real. She says she stayed silent about her pregnancy out of fear that the moment he found out, he'd disappear. And according to her, that's exactly what happened. The second she said, "I'm expecting, we need to get married," everything allegedly changed. Suddenly the love turned into accusations. Suddenly the promises turned into denial. Suddenly she was being blamed, doubted, and discarded. And while she was left pregnant and alone, he allegedly went back to New York, back to Remy Ma, living life like nothing happened. No protection, no responsibility, no accountability, just silence. This isn't just a breakup story. This is a woman claiming she was emotionally used, financially played, and abandoned at her most vulnerable moment. And now the question everyone is asking is chilling. Was this all a setup from the beginning? Was the divorce drama just a performance? And did an unborn child become collateral damage in a celebrity double life? Because if Claressa Shields is telling the truth, this isn't gossip anymore. This is a tragedy.
I knew my man had to come through for the baddest, for his queen. He came, Louis Vuitton travel bag with the travel.
Buckle up, because what you're about to hear isn't a rumor whispered in corners. It's a testimony delivered to the court of public opinion, where silence is evidence and tears are exhibits. This story doesn't ask for sympathy. It demands attention. The camera went live and the mask came off. No entourage, no filters, no soundtrack. Just a woman breathing through pain, eyes red, voice trembling, telling the world that strength can still crack. The first words weren't dramatic. They were necessary. The kind of words people say when they've carried a secret too long and the weight finally wins. She said she was pregnant. Not as a tease. Not as a headline. As a fact she'd buried out of fear. The room shifted. Viewers leaned closer. Comment sections froze. This wasn't an announcement, it was a confession. And then came the reason she says she hid it. Not vanity. Not timing. Fear. The kind that grows when promises start sounding rehearsed and timelines keep moving. According to her, the relationship didn't begin with chaos. It began with assurance. Private conversations that painted a future in permanent ink. Marriage mentioned casually, then seriously. Divorce spoken of as inevitable, then imminent. Words delivered with confidence, repeated often enough to feel real. She says she was told the past was already closed, that legal steps were underway, that public confirmation was just a matter of time.
Yeah, I went and spent a good 90K on my wrist, and then I got a good 60K in my hand. You feel me? Yeah. This that fight money.
This that fight money.
Fight for real, for real. Yeah, knock him out, Debo. See Debo. Yeah, a little 90K on the mold.
She believed it. Belief changes behavior. Belief invites vulnerability. Belief is how boundaries get lowered and plans get built. She says intimacy followed certainty, not recklessness. She says it wasn't accidental. It was conditional, built on the understanding that commitment was locked in. Then reality started stalling. Days passed. Announcements didn't come. Explanations multiplied. Reassurance became reactive instead of proactive. Still, she says she held on, because belief doesn't vanish quickly, it erodes. And when she realized she was pregnant, the erosion turned into dread. She didn't post. She didn't tell friends. She didn't celebrate. She waited. Why wait? She says the answer is simple and devastating. Because she suspected the truth would change everything. Because she'd seen how fast affection cools when responsibility enters the room. Because the love she was promised felt fragile, conditional, dependent on convenience. So she protected herself with silence. When she finally spoke, she says the response wasn't joy. It wasn't concern. It wasn't accountability. It was distance. The tone shifted. The questions sharpened. The warmth drained. Suddenly there were doubts about timelines, insinuations about fidelity, a pivot from partnership to prosecution. She says she went from future spouse to defendant overnight. Accusations followed. Paternity questioned. Intentions challenged. Trust reversed. In her telling, the pivot was ruthless. The same voice that once outlined wedding plans now questioned character. The same confidence that promised permanence now denied responsibility. And the whiplash wasn't just emotional, it was public. Because while she was processing fear and shock, she says he left. Not quietly, not temporarily. He went back to familiar ground, reappearing alongside the very history he claimed was over. Photos surfaced. Smiles looked effortless. The contrast was brutal. One life continued uninterrupted. Another was forced to pause. She says that's when clarity arrived. Not peace, clarity. The realization that the divorce talk, the public demands, the dramatic posture may have been less about closure and more about optics. A performance meant to buy time, to manage perception, to keep multiple narratives alive without consequence. She alleges she was used emotionally first, then financially. That her presence served a purpose while it was convenient, and her silence was expected once it wasn't. That the pregnancy didn't complicate the story, it exposed it. The live audience watched her steady herself and continue. This wasn't rage. It was record-keeping. Dates referenced. Conversations paraphrased. Shifts in behavior noted. The kind of testimony that doesn't scream because it doesn't need to. Each sentence added weight. She didn't ask for judgment. She asked for understanding. She said she wasn't perfect, but she was honest. That she didn't plan to be a headline, but she refused to be erased. That hiding the pregnancy wasn't shame, it was self-preservation in a situation that felt unstable. And then came the line that changed the temperature. She said she refused to carry blame for protecting her child. That silence doesn't equal guilt. That trusting the wrong person doesn't make you complicit in their choices.
Self-made, self-built. I got $8 million. Are you dumb?
The courtroom of the internet reacted instantly. Clips spread. Commentary ignited. Support collided with skepticism. Questions multiplied. Not just about the relationship, but about patterns, about how often confidence masks indecision, how often promises are deployed as placeholders, how often women are asked to wait while timelines benefit someone else. This wasn't framed as revenge. It was framed as a record. A refusal to let the narrative be rewritten by absence. She acknowledged the risk of speaking out. The backlash. The labels. But she said the alternative, staying quiet while being blamed, was worse. That her story deserved daylight even if it complicated reputations. As the live stream continued, the tone shifted again, not toward hope, but toward resolve. She said she was done protecting a version of events that didn't protect her. Done shrinking to preserve someone else's comfort. Done absorbing doubt so others could avoid accountability. The testimony ended without theatrics. No cliffhanger. No demands. Just a closing thought that lingered longer than any accusation. That truth doesn't always arrive loudly, but when it does, it changes the room. And the room changed. Because this isn't just about a relationship gone wrong. It's about how narratives are built, who gets to control them, and what happens when the person expected to stay silent decides to speak. It's about the cost of believing promises that benefit one side more than the other. It's about how quickly love can become litigation when consequences appear. The record is now public. The jury is restless. And the questions won't stop circling. If the account is accurate, this wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Not miscommunication, but misdirection. Not heartbreak alone, but abandonment at the moment protection mattered most. And if there's one thing this testimony made clear, it's this: silence can be demanded, but it can't be enforced forever. When it breaks, it doesn't whisper. It documents.
You got Pap's name tatted on you?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Is this the first time you ever got a man's name tatted?
Yeah.
Shout out to that.
Are you crazy?
I already knew the answer. I just had to ask.
Oh, I said who else deserves to have their name tatted on my body?
Just Pap.
That's it.
The silence that followed didn't soften anything, it sharpened it. What came next unfolded not in whispers, but in fragments scattered across timelines, comment sections, and late-night voice notes dissected by strangers who suddenly felt like witnesses. Her account didn't fade after the live ended. It multiplied. Screenshots resurfaced. Old interviews were rewatched with new suspicion. Every smile was reinterpreted, every pause examined like evidence that had been hiding in plain sight. According to her version, the aftermath was colder than the buildup. Messages went unanswered. Calls were shortened, then avoided. The cadence of communication changed from reassurance to distance, from certainty to technicalities. She says concern was replaced by calculation. The focus wasn't on her health, or the reality of what she was carrying, but on optics, how this would look, who would say what, and how fast control could be regained. She describes being told to slow down, to not rush announcements, to keep things private for now. The same privacy that once felt intimate now felt strategic. The same discretion that once protected a relationship now shielded someone else's freedom. And as days passed, she says the responsibility of silence shifted entirely onto her shoulders. What unsettled observers wasn't just the denial she claims followed, but the speed. One moment there were plans. The next, there were disclaimers. She recounts conversations where timelines were suddenly fuzzy, where promises were reframed as misunderstandings, where words once spoken with certainty were reclassified as hypotheticals. The ground didn't crack, it slid. Then came the images. Not announcements, not statements, images. Familiar locations. Familiar company. Laughter captured without context, but heavy with implication. To her, those images weren't just painful, they were instructive. They told her where she stood without a conversation. They closed doors she hadn't realized were already shutting. In private, she says she was urged to consider all possibilities. Language that sounded neutral but felt accusatory. Questions posed as concern but landed as suspicion. She says the implication was clear: doubt first, support later, if at all. And in that space, she realized the story she'd been living inside no longer belonged to her. As the public reacted, the narrative began to splinter. Some questioned her timing. Others questioned her motives. A familiar cycle took shape. Credibility debated, character weighed, empathy rationed. She watched as strangers argued over whether pain needed to be palatable to be believed, whether composure determined truth, whether a woman could be both strong and wounded without one negating the other. She didn't respond immediately. She says she waited because reacting felt like feeding a machine that was already hungry. But the longer she waited, the louder the speculation became. Silence was no longer neutral, it was interpreted. So she spoke again, not louder, but clearer. She reiterated that she wasn't asking for permission to tell her story. She was documenting it. Her emphasis shifted from romance to responsibility, from emotion to sequence. She outlined how expectations were set, how assurances were repeated, how decisions were made in reliance on those assurances. This wasn't about feelings, she insisted. It was about reliance. About what happens when someone builds a future based on representations that later dissolve. Observers noted the change in tone. Less vulnerability, more resolve. Less pleading, more precision. She wasn't trying to win an argument, she was preserving a record. And that record began to resonate with people who recognized the pattern, not the personalities, but the mechanics. The slow drift. The conditional care. The sudden retreat once accountability entered the room. Meanwhile, the other side remained largely quiet. No sweeping denial. No detailed rebuttal. Just distance. And in the court of public opinion, absence speaks its own language. Every non-response was interpreted, debated, and reinterpreted again. Some saw restraint. Others saw avoidance. The vacuum became a canvas. She addressed the question many were asking, but few wanted to say out loud, why now? Her answer was direct. Because timing wasn't strategic, it was inevitable. Because hiding the truth had started to feel like complicity. Because carrying a life while carrying a lie was unsustainable. And because waiting for comfort had already cost her clarity. She also rejected the framing that cast her as reckless. She described fear, not impulsivity. Hesitation, not manipulation. She reminded viewers that caution isn't weakness and silence isn't consent. That protecting oneself in uncertainty is not deception, it's survival. As reactions intensified, another layer emerged, the cost. She spoke about emotional tolls that don't trend. Sleepless nights. Medical appointments attended alone. Decisions made without partnership. The quiet math of preparing for a future that suddenly looked very different than the one she'd been promised. None of it dramatic enough for headlines, all of it heavy enough to change a life. The story began to outgrow the individuals involved. It became a mirror for a broader discomfort, how often narratives are controlled by whoever speaks last, loudest, or not at all. How quickly responsibility is reframed as inconvenience. How easily doubt is weaponized when certainty no longer serves. She acknowledged the backlash. She didn't pretend it wouldn't come. She named the labels before they could be assigned bitter, opportunistic, emotional. Then she dismissed them, not defensively, but decisively. She said none of those labels change facts. None of that—
Look at him, man. Papoose, Papoose, Papoose. 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 Papoose.
Can't be on it, cause I be on that mug.
Papoose. Yeah. Papoose. 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 Every time I say his name, we get more and more comments. You get the flying. Papoose.
At the end of the day, this is a danger.
The tension didn't dissipate, it concentrated. What followed wasn't resolution but recoil, a tightening of narratives as every side adjusted to the fact that the story no longer moved on a single track. Analysts, commentators, and anonymous insiders began to frame what had already been said as if it were evidence, not emotion. Timelines were reconstructed. Language was parsed. Silence was treated as subtext. The most striking shift came in how the conversation changed tone. The focus moved away from personalities and toward patterns. Viewers stopped asking who is right and started asking how this keeps happening. How certainty is promised before it's earned. How futures are sketched before responsibilities are accepted. How the burden of proof is quietly reassigned when consequences arrive. She stayed visible, but not reactive. There were no daily updates, no spirals, no attempts to outpace speculation. Instead, she appeared measured, deliberate, as if every word carried a cost she was no longer willing to overpay. When she spoke, she returned to sequence, not sentiment. What was said, when it was said, what followed, what didn't. That steadiness unsettled people. It disrupted the expectation that pain must be loud to be credible. Critics searched for contradictions and found none that mattered. Supporters searched for catharsis and didn't get it. What they got instead was consistency. The same account, delivered without escalation, without embellishment, without retreat. Then the ripple effects began. Old footage resurfaced, not because it proved anything new, but because it sounded different now. Statements once brushed off as generic took on sharper edges. Casual remarks about timelines, loyalty, and priorities felt less casual in retrospect. It wasn't that the past had changed, it was that the lens had. She addressed the growing archive with restraint. She refused to narrate every clip, declined to assign motives to every frame. She said the record could speak without her directing it. That insistence on restraint became its own statement. In a space built on amplification, refusal became control. The question of accountability returned, heavier this time. Not as a demand, but as an absence. People noticed what wasn't happening. No clarification. No acknowledgement. No attempt to meet the substance of the claims with substance of their own. The quiet stretched, and with it, interpretations hardened. Some framed the quiet as dignity. Others called it avoidance. But even those inclined to defend struggled to explain why reassurance had once been abundant and was now non-existent. Why certainty had evaporated exactly when certainty was most needed. Why a situation that demanded care received distance instead. She spoke again, briefly, to address the one issue she said mattered above all else: safety. Not physical spectacle, but stability. She talked about building routines, seeking support, prioritizing health. She avoided naming names. She avoided rehashing details. She centered the present, not the conflict. That choice shifted the temperature. The story stopped being about exposure and started being about endurance. And endurance, it turns out, is harder to dismiss. The narrative reached a point where outrage could no longer sustain itself without substance. The easy arguments ran out. What remained were questions without satisfying answers. The kind that don't trend but linger. What responsibility looks like when plans dissolve. What honesty requires when promises are remembered differently. What silence costs when someone else is left to explain everything. Observers noted how often the burden had shifted to her to prove restraint, credibility, patience. How rarely the same standards were applied elsewhere. The imbalance became part of the story, not as accusation, but as observation. The discourse fractured again, this time along quieter lines. People shared their own experiences, not to compare, but to contextualize. Stories of being assured, then abandoned. Of timelines that moved only one way. Of commitments that dissolved under scrutiny. The individual narrative became collective, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. She acknowledged that familiarity with a single sentence that carried more weight than any accusation. This isn't rare. That line landed because it didn't ask for outrage, it asked for recognition. As the weeks passed, the story stopped accelerating and started settling. Not fading, but solidifying. The facts as she presented them remained unchanged. The responses remained absent. The room stayed rearranged. In that stillness, the tragedy sharpened. Not because of spectacle, but because of what couldn't be undone. Trust extended can't be recalled. Time invested doesn't reset. Expectations built don't evaporate just because they become inconvenient. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as responsible for herself, for what she carries, for the truth as she knows it. That framing denied critics their easiest angle. There was no collapse to exploit, no chaos to mock. Just resolve. The final shift came quietly. Attention moved on as it always does. New stories crowded feeds. New controversies demanded reaction. But this one didn't disappear. It stayed, referenced in passing, invoked as example, cited without explanation. A shorthand for a pattern people recognized without needing details. She remained consistent to the end. No dramatic closer. No call for judgment. No demand for apology. She said what she needed to say, then stopped. That choice marked the true end of the spectacle and the beginning of consequence. Because when a story ends without reconciliation, it doesn't vanish, it integrates. It becomes part of how people listen next time. Part of how promises are weighed. part of how silence is interpreted. The tragedy here isn't confined to a relationship or a moment. It's in the space between assurance and action. In the gap where responsibility should have been. In the quiet that followed certainty, and the clarity that arrived too late to prevent damage, but just in time to prevent erasure. Nothing about this resolves cleanly. There is no final statement that ties it up. No mutual agreement that restores balance. What remains is a record, spoken carefully, maintained consistently, and left intact. And records have a way of outlasting reactions. The room is quieter now, but it hasn't returned to its original shape. It can't. Something was said that can't be unsaid. Something was seen that can't be unseen. And even as attention drifts elsewhere, the structure of the story holds. Not because it was shouted, but because it was sustained. That's the part people don't anticipate, the endurance of a narrative that doesn't chase closure. It doesn't demand belief. It simply refuses to disappear. And in that refusal, the truth, whatever each person believes it to be, continues to exert its weight. The story doesn't end here. Every screen, every timeline, every comment thread is now a witness. The weight of what was said, what was hidden, and what was revealed hangs heavy in the digital air. People are watching. People are judging. But more than that, they are questioning how far manipulation can reach when promises are weaponized and trust is exploited. Every viewer now carries a piece of this narrative. Every share amplifies the consequences. She has spoken. She has revealed. She has endured. And now the world must decide what it does with the truth. Will it normalize betrayal, shrug at abandonment, or demand accountability? The silence on the other side speaks louder than any statement ever could. It's a void filled with questions, speculation, and undeniable implications. Every paused clip, every muted notification, every ignored message becomes part of the evidence, part of the story that refuses to be silenced. This is not entertainment. This is exposure. Not just of a relationship gone wrong, but of the systems that allow promises to be broken without consequence, of the calculated power plays that leave lives shattered in their wake. It's tragic. It's ruthless. It's real, or at least as real as anyone dares to acknowledge. And it will not fade quietly. So watch closely. Share widely. Debate fiercely. The world is no longer a passive observer. Every like, every comment, every reaction is part of the courtroom now. She has done her part, spoken her truth. The rest is up to the audience. The consequences are in your hands. Every click keeps the record alive. Every view spreads the revelation. Every discussion ensures the story refuses to be buried. The question is no longer what happened. The question is who will face it and who will let it change the way the game is played next.